I'm George Schneider, a World War II veteran, fought in the European theater. I participated in the 5 major campaigns, beginning with the D-Day landings in Omaha Beach, and participating in all 5 campaigns, which were the Normandy Campaign, the Northern France Campaign, the Rhinelands, the Ardennes, which is the Battle of the Bulge, and then the last one was Central Europe. Now, today we're going to talk about only one campaign, and in future programs we'll be covering the other 4. And the Normandy Campaign officially began on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, with the landings on the 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, and then there was Utah, Juneau, and Sword. And the 5 landings all took place simultaneously. And the Normandy Campaign began on this date and lasted for 6 weeks, ending with the breakout at St. Lo. And from then on, it was called the Northern France Campaign. But today we're going to cover the Normandy Campaign. Now, I did not participate in the landings on D-Day. I went into Omaha Beach after it was secure. And then for the next 3 weeks, I was in various replacement camps in Normandy and not in any actual combat. Although these replacement depots were subject to artillery attacks, and one night we had a very bad aerial attack. Several men were killed. But it wasn't until I joined the outfit later on that I actually went into combat. So after about 3 weeks in these replacement depots, I was summoned to an apple orchard in Normandy, which is very common in that part of the country. I was summoned there with 8 other men, and a lieutenant began speaking to us. And I can't use the language he used because the terms he used for us were a little derogatory. And so I'll have to edit it somewhat. So this is what he said. He said, all right, you men, you're going into combat. Now I want you to look at the man on your right. He said, take a good look. He said, now look at the one on your left. He said, look real well, because you might never see him again, because in 24 hours, some of you are going to be dead. And this is when it dawned on me. Here I was, 19 years old, and I figured, this is for real. And we marched out, and of course, single file, 20 paces behind the man in front of you. We had no idea where we were going. We walked through St. Lo, which had been heavily bombed that afternoon, and we finally, in total darkness, we reached our destination. And someone took me by the hand and said, you're now in the 3rd Battalion, you're a scout and observer in the 3rd Battalion of the 120th Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division. Now the 30th Division was an old North Carolina, Tennessee National Guard, which subsequently fought in all 5 campaigns, and by the time we met the Russians and the war ended, we had logged more time than any other division in Europe. And we had more Congressional Medals of Honor. We had 6, which is more than any other division. And this came at a cost, because we had 19,000 casualties. Of course, the division is usually considered 15,000, so we had a complete turnover. And of those, we had over 3,830 who were killed. Now, after the war, a commission selected by Eisenhower to make a study of divisions selected us as the #1 division. So I'm very proud to have served in the old Hickory, which was named after Andrew Jackson. Now, the Battle of Normandy, after D-Day and the beaches were secured, the fighting consisted of land battles in apple orchards and fields in Normandy. And these fields are separated, the farms are very small, they've been there for centuries and generations, and their boundaries are covered by hedgerows. The French call this the bocage. And these vary in height, and I've seen different reports which exaggerate the height of them, and some of them minimize it. But I would say that the average height is about 6 feet. And they've been there for centuries. As they farmed the land, they would remove rocks and pile them up on the hedgerow, and then trees would grow. And these are actually covered with trees and rocks and dirt, about 6 feet high. And these provide excellent barriers for the Germans. They would, we'd have to take them one at a time, and they would have all the openings zeroed in with their machine guns. So this is a very slow and tedious process. And after 6 weeks, it was decided that we had to break out of the hedgerow country. And they came up with a plan that had never been done before. It was codenamed Operation Cobra. And the operation called for high-altitude saturation bombing of the front line, which had never been done before. The bombing had always been restricted to military targets deep into the continent, manufacturing areas in Germany and shipyards and airports, things like that, and the cities, of course, also. So this was to be the high-altitude saturation bombing of the front line. Now, we were on the front line, and our division was selected to make the breakout once the bombing took place. So to avoid any collateral damage, we were pulled back about 700 yards. And then on the 24th of July, the bombing started. And it was, we had well, I don't know how many planes participated in that day, but the first few flights dropped some bombs short on us. And when it was realized that the bombing was falling on friendly forces, they scratched the mission, but on the 25th they decided to do it again. And this time it was even worse. And General Leslie McNair joined my battalion. He had just become general in charge of all of the ground forces in Europe. And he was with my battalion, and he was killed by this bombing. He was never found. Only his helmet was found. But this took place on the 25th of July, and after the bombing, we were successful in breaking out. And then I see programs which do not treat this very well. One of them I saw recently said that there was a heavy bombing at St. Lo, and then the American forces broke out, and Patton started racing toward Paris. Well, that's simplified. Actually, Patton did not participate in the Battle of Normandy. He didn't get to France until the 25th or so of July, which puts him on French soil about the time the Normandy Campaign ended, which was the 25th of July. But it's true, once we broke through, he did get his tanks moving and heading toward Paris. Now, about this same time, Montgomery, he landed his troops on Sword Beach, which was the northeasternmost beach, and he was to take the city of Caen the first day, on D-Day. 6 weeks later, he still hadn't taken it. So he decided to carpet bomb the city. And he leveled the city, destroyed a beautiful old French medieval city, only to find out that the Germans had left, had vacated most of the city and were retreating through what was known as the Falaise Gap. Now, Patton wanted to swing north and have Montgomery come south, and then we would have pinched off hundreds of thousands of Germans in Normandy. Montgomery wouldn't go along with this. I suspect there were two reasons. One of them, he was engaging in a very serious tank battle. And the other reason was, I don't know, he might be making his tea, I don't know. But anyhow, this caused Patton to be furious because we passed up a chance to almost put an end to the war by capturing hundreds of thousands of Germans. Now, Hitler also had plans. Instead of having his troops sneak back to Germany through the Falaise Gap, he ordered a counterattack to try to break through to the sea again, all the way back to the English Channel. And he massed several panzer divisions. These are tank armored divisions and some infantry. And they began an attack. The problem was they had to go through a village in France called Mortain. And the problem was that our division was at Mortain. And we occupied the eastern part of the town, which was the highest elevation that faced the plain to the east from which the counterattack came. And this battle is one of the most underrated battles of the World War II. Basically, 150 men from my regiment stopped this counterattack of several thousand Germans. And these were not foot soldiers, these were armored tanks. And the way this was done, these 150 men occupied this highest elevation, which was Hill 314, which was 314 meters above sea level. And from this vantage point, we could observe the oncoming attack. And the forward observer could call in artillery and stop the attack. And he did this. A forward observer, Robert Wise, called in the artillery, and for six days they stopped this attack. And after 6 days, the German general in charge, General von Klug, called Hitler and he said, "I just can't get past Hill 314. He said, "I've got to retreat." And he had to retreat, committed suicide, and before he did, he said that was a turning point of the war. He just couldn't get past those 150 men up on Hill 314. Of course, very few of those survived because they were getting bombarded with German artillery at the same time. Now that battle, like I say, was very underrated. Now I've seen programs where they said the Germans tried to counterattack, but they were stopped at Mortain by rocket-firing Hurricane fighter planes. Well, this is not true. We had some fighter planes, and they did participate, but like I say, even General von Klug admitted that it was the artillery from Hill 314 that stopped at the Battle of Mortain. Now, actually, the Normandy Campaign ended with the outbreak at St. Lo, and the following campaign was the Northern Campaign. So the Battle of Mortain was actually fought during the Battle of Northern France, which we'll cover in a subsequent program. But it was still in Normandy, so I covered in Normandy. The bombing that took place, you don't read about that too much either. The bombing took place because the Air Force did not participate the way they were supposed to. They were supposed to come in parallel to the front lines, and this would have subjected their right flank to German anti-aircraft fire, which they had quite a bit of. And so they came in perpendicular to the line, so they were flying over us before they got to the target. And naturally, a lot of the bombs fell short. And in these 2 days, we suffered 681 casualties. You don't really hear about that either. They don't like to talk about that. And of course, these were not all killed. We had over 50 killed. We had over 50 which were never found. They were blown to pieces. And we had a lot of shell shock cases. So 681 casualties we had from that. So that was essentially the Battle of Normandy, and it ended the 25th of July. Now, people ask, who were these 150 men, and who were the invaders on Normandy, like the 29th Division, a division out of mostly Virginia? These were 18 to 25-year-olds. And if you go to the cemetery in France overlooking, you can see all their graves, and it gives their unit and the day they were killed, the state they were from, and that's about all the information they provide. But these were all young men, and you recall that this was the greatest generation, and all of these had a childhood during the Great Depression, and it was the same during the Depression when they were school children. They were of grade school age and high school age, and then when the war came along, they were the 18 to 26-year-olds, and this was a generation that Tom Brokaw coined the greatest generation. Now, the reason it was the greatest generation, in my opinion, is that it was the hardships of the great generation that molded the character of these. And the character was a little different than what we see today, I'm convinced. Now, I hope that we were not the greatest generation. I hope we have greater generations to come. Now, most of these are buried in two cemeteries in Normandy. They're overlooking, the one is what is known as the Normandy Cemetery. It's in a little village in France called some little village in France, but it's known as the Normandy Cemetery. And incidentally, it's not the largest World War II cemetery in Europe. A lot of people think it is, but the largest one is the Lorraine Cemetery in France. But the Normandy Cemetery contains over 9,400 graves. The Lorraine Cemetery has over 10,400. Now, this cemetery overlooks Omaha Beach, and then there's another one called the Brittany Cemetery. There are others in France, but these are the only two in Normandy. The Germans also have a cemetery in Normandy, only a few kilometers from the Normandy Cemetery. And in this cemetery, they have a much smaller area, but they have double the number that's in Normandy Cemetery. And so many of them are Ein Deutsch Soldat, unknown soldiers. They bury them in pairs, and they have a little pagoda there, and there are the names. There's a book with the names of the buried soldiers, and I counted 69 Schneiders buried there. So you wonder why I wasn't in the other army, I guess. But my background is actually French, and that's one reason I was chosen to be a scout in the infantry, because I spoke French, and I could contact the resistance forces in France and Belgium, which I did. And so anyhow, my folks were French Alsatian. You know, anyone who claims to be French and they have a German-sounding name, you can trace all of them back to Alsace. In the War of 1870, Alsace was French. And then in the War of 1870, the Germans won. And I had a grandfather who had 5 brothers. 3 of them fought with the French, 3 of them fought with the Germans. And after the war, my grandfather was on the losing side, and he couldn't stomach what took place, because all the schools began teaching German, the street signs changed to German names, even the villages. Even today you go back and all those are German-sounding villages. So he moved to the French part of Switzerland, which is where my father was born, and they always considered themselves French Swiss after that. They emigrated to this country, and I was a first-generation American. And like I said earlier, I grew up during the Great Depression, and subsequently have been included in the greatest generation. that pretty much covers the Normandy campaign. I can't participate in any actual combat because I was in the replacement pools, but I do have credit for participating in the Normandy campaign. Like I said, we're going to have a subsequent programs will cover the other 4 campaigns. The next one, we'll take them in order as we moved across France. The next one will be the Northern France campaign, and then we'll follow that with the Rhinelands, which covers going into Belgium and the Netherlands and into Germany, and then the Ardennes campaign, which is the Battle of the Bulge, and then we go back to the Rhinelands campaign again as we get prepared to cross the Rhine River, and then the final campaign will be the Rhine River. So these are the campaigns we propose to discuss in future programs, and I hope you can enjoy this one and any subsequent program that we have. I hope to see you then. Until then, we'll sign off now and wish you a good day, and God bless America, and salute.